The sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter floated through the air of Bellamy's, where crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and polished silverware. In this world of wealth and privilege, Aria Johnson moved with practiced grace, balancing 3 plates of seared scallops along her arm as she navigated between tables. "Excuse me, miss," a voice called out just as she finished setting down the last plate. Aria turned, her restaurant-mandated smile already in place. It had been a 12-hour shift, and her feet were screaming in the uncomfortable formal shoes the restaurant required female staff to wear. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" she asked, smoothing down her crisp black uniform. The man at table 7 complained about his steak being overcooked, though Aria could see it was perfectly medium rare. She apologized anyway and promised to bring a new one immediately. That was the rule at Bellamy's. The customer was always right, especially when they were wrong. In the kitchen, she leaned against the wall for just a moment, closing her eyes. "You okay, Aria?" asked Dayon, the sous chef who had become something of a friend during her 8 months at the restaurant. "Just tired," she replied, opening her eyes and straightening her posture. "Can you rush a ribeye medium rare? Table 7 claims his is overcooked." Dayon rolled his eyes but nodded. "You know, most people go to bed when they're tired. They don't work double shifts at fancy restaurants and then head straight to music school." Aria smiled despite her exhaustion. Most people don't have tuition payments due next week. The kitchen was hot and busy, but it was her favorite place in the restaurant. Here at least she could be herself for a few seconds between tables. No forced smiles, no pretending not to notice when customers treated her differently than they treated the white servers. Through the kitchen door, she could see the grand piano in the corner of the main dining room. Tonight, a middle-aged man in a tuxedo played classical pieces that served as background music for wealthy diners who barely noticed. The irony wasn't lost on Aria. She'd give anything to be the one at that piano, but instead, she was rushing plates and taking orders from people who could afford to drop on a single meal what she made in an entire day. Aria checked her watch. 3 more hours until closing. Then she could head home, change and make it to her late-night composition class. Professor Lin had been understanding about her work schedule, allowing her to arrive after the class had already begun. "Artists have had to balance work and passion since the beginning of time," he'd told her. "Bach had 20 children to feed. Compared to that, you're living easy." It didn't feel easy. Nothing had felt easy since her grandmother passed away last year, leaving Aria with the small inheritance that had gotten her started at the city's prestigious school of music. But the money had run out faster than expected, between tuition and the cost of living in the city. That's when Bellamy's had seemed like the perfect solution. Expensive restaurant meant good tips, and the location was only a 20-minute bus ride from campus. "Order up." "Aria," Dayon called, sliding the new steak onto the pass. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted the plate. "Thanks, Dayon. Wish me luck with table 7. Back in the dining room, Aria's eyes were drawn again to the piano. The melody floating through the air was Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of the first pieces her grandmother had taught her to play. She remembered sitting on the worn piano bench in their small living room, her fingers stretching to reach the right keys while her grandmother gently guided her hands. "Perfect music for daydreaming, isn't it?" Aria startled, nearly dropping the steak. The voice belonged to an older woman seated at a small table near the piano. The woman smiled kindly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to stare," Aria said quickly. "No need to apologize for appreciating beauty," the woman replied, though between us his interpretation lacks heart. Too technical, Aria couldn't help but smile. The woman had put into words exactly what she'd been thinking. "Do you play?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am. I study at the School of Music, actually." The woman's eyebrows rose with interest. "Well, isn't that something? Working here and studying music. You must be very dedicated." Before Aria could respond, a sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Excuse me, is that my steak you're holding while you chat?" The man at table 7 was glaring at her. "I'm so sorry, sir." "Right away." Aria hurried to deliver the steak, feeling the burn of embarrassment on her cheeks. As the night wore on, Aria moved between tables with the practiced efficiency that had made her one of the restaurant's top servers, despite being one of the newest. She memorized orders, remembered preferences, anticipated needs. It was like performing a dance, and in some ways not so different from playing music. There was rhythm to it, patterns. The trick was to make it look effortless, During a rare quiet moment, she found herself near the piano again. The pianist was on break, and the beautiful instrument sat unattended. Arya glanced around. The manager was busy at the host stand, and her section was momentarily satisfied with full glasses and fresh food. She reached out, letting her fingers hover just above the keys without touching them. In her mind, she could hear the piece she'd been working on for her composition class. A blend of classical structure and jazz influences that Professor Lin had called promising, but still searching for its voice. You should just go for it. Arya jumped back from the piano. It was Zoe, another server, carrying a tray of dirty dishes. Are you crazy? Arya whispered. Mr. Reynolds would fire me on the spot. Zoe shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe you'd blow everyone away and get discovered by some rich music producer having dinner here. That only happens in movies, Arya said, though she couldn't help smiling at the fantasy. Speaking of movies, Zoe said, nodding toward the entrance. Isn't that the guy from that legal drama? The one with the cheekbones? Arya turned to look. The host was indeed seating someone who looked vaguely familiar from television, accompanied by what appeared to be an entourage of important-looking people in expensive suits. Great, Zoe muttered. They're in your section. Lucky you, Arya sighed, mentally calculating how late she would be to class tonight. VIPs always meant extra attention, longer meals, and often surprisingly mediocre tips from people who thought their presence was payment enough. As she approached the newly seated table to introduce herself, Arya noticed one man in particular who seemed to command attention from the others. He wasn't the actor, but rather a sharp-featured man in his 50s wearing a suit that probably cost more than her semester's tuition. He barely glanced at Arya as she welcomed them to Bellamy's. We'll start with your best champagne, he said, cutting her off mid-sentence. Dom Perignon 2008 if you have it. Of course, sir. Right away. Arya responded smoothly. As she walked away to get their drinks, she could feel eyes on her back. It was a feeling she knew well, being watched, evaluated, judged. 8 years of classical piano training, 3 years of music theory, and here she was, being sized up on how quickly she could fetch champagne. But tonight, like every night, Arya reminded herself why she was here. Each difficult customer, each double shift, each aching foot at the end of the night was one step closer to her real life. The one where she sat at a piano on a stage, instead of balancing trays in a restaurant. The pianist had returned to his spot and began playing again, this time a piece by Chopin. Arya allowed herself to listen for just a moment as she waited at the bar for the champagne. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, playing along invisibly. You're a million miles away, said Ray, the bartender, as he carefully presented the bottle of Dom Perignon on a silver tray, along with 8 crystal flutes. Just thinking about my composition project, Arya admitted. It's due next week and I've hit a wall with the middle section. Music problems, Ray said with a grin. Way above my pay grade. But hey, at least your fancy education is good for something. You always remember the drink orders perfectly. Arya laughed. Ear training has its practical applications, I guess. She carried the champagne to the VIP table with careful precision. The sharp-featured man barely acknowledged her as she poured, continuing his animated story about a recent business acquisition. Only when she accidentally clinked a glass while setting it down did he pause, giving her an irritated glance that made her stomach tighten. Sorry about that. Sir? She said quietly. He waved her away with a flick of his wrist, returning to his story. Arya stepped back, waiting at a respectful distance to take their dinner orders. As she stood there, she allowed her mind to drift to the piece she was composing. Professor Lin had challenged them to create something personal, something that told their story. Arya had been struggling with it, finding it difficult to translate her experiences into music without it sounding like a cliché. How do you capture in music the feeling of standing invisible in a room full of people? How do you compose the sound of dreams deferred but not abandoned? A burst of laughter from the table brought her attention back to the present. The sharp-featured man was now looking directly at her, and something in his expression made her uneasy. We're ready to order now, he said, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate waiting. As Arya took their complicated orders, special requests, substitutions, off-menu items they assumed the kitchen could prepare, she maintained her professional demeanor. But inside, a melody was taking shape, inspired by this very moment, the contrast between the elegant piano music filling the room and the subtle tensions playing out at tables across the restaurant. Tonight, when she finally made it to her tiny apartment, she would sit at her keyboard with its missing D-sharp key and try to capture that feeling. For now, though, she had steaks to serve, wines to pour, and 3 more hours of smiling through whatever came her way, because that's what it took to keep her dream alive. This unglamorous behind-the-scenes work that no one would ever see or appreciate once she finally made it. If she made it. When she made it, the pianist transitioned into a jazzier number, his fingers dancing across the keys with technical precision if not emotional depth. Arya allowed herself one more glance at the piano before heading back to the kitchen. Someday, she promised herself. Someday. The next evening brought a thunderstorm that rattled the windows of Bellamy's and sent rainwater streaming down the elegant glass facade. Arya arrived early for her shift, shaking droplets from her umbrella in the staff entrance. The storm had caused delays on the bus line, making her anxious about being late. "Cutting it close," remarked Vivian, the hostess, as Arya hurried to clock in. "Bus was running behind," Arya explained, quickly tying her apron and checking her appearance in the small mirror beside the time clock. Her curls had frizzed slightly in the humidity, and she tucked a few stray strands back into place. "Well, you picked a good night to be almost late," Vivian said, lowering her voice. "Maxwell Richardson just called to reserve the private dining room. Last minute, of course, because why would a billionaire need to plan ahead like the rest of us?" Arya's stomach tightened. Maxwell Richardson was infamous among the staff at Bellamy's. The real estate tycoon had made his fortune developing luxury properties throughout the city, often at the expense of historic buildings and affordable housing. His reputation as a customer was equally notorious, demanding, impatient, and notoriously stingy with tips despite his enormous wealth. "Please tell me he's not in my section," Arya said, though she already knew the answer. The private dining room was part of her assigned area tonight. "Sorry, honey. I'd switch you if I could, but Mr. Reynolds specifically wants you serving him. Says you're the only one who can handle his attitude without messing up the orders." Vivian squeezed Arya's shoulder sympathetically. "Look at it this way. At least he brings important people. Maybe one of them will tip well enough to make up for him." Arya nodded, trying to see the bright side. She needed every dollar tonight. Her rent was due in 3 days, and her last check from the restaurant had gone almost entirely to her tuition payment. "Do we know how many in his party?" she asked, mentally calculating how much she might make if even a few of them tipped the standard 20%. 8 total. Some big shots from uptown. I think they're celebrating a deal of some kind." Vivian glanced toward the door. "And speaking of the Devil's Dinner Party, that town car pulling up is probably them. Better get the private room ready." Arya hurried to prepare the elegant room at the back of the restaurant. She checked each place setting, made sure the wine glasses gleamed under the lights, and adjusted the fresh flowers in the centerpiece. Everything had to be perfect. Mr. Reynolds had made it clear that Maxwell Richardson's business was vital to the restaurant, even if the staff collectively dreaded his visits. As she finished lighting the candles, Arya heard the distinct sound of Maxwell's laugh, loud and forced, coming from the main dining room. She took a deep breath and smoothed her hands down her uniform. "Just another customer," she whispered to herself. Just another night. But Maxwell Richardson was never just another customer. He entered the private dining room like he owned the place, leading a group of men and women in expensive suits. At 53, he stood tall with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. Well, he said, catching sight of Arya. "They've given us the quiet one tonight." The others in his party chuckled as they took their seats. Arya recognized a few faces: a city council member, a prominent attorney, 2 real estate developers who often appeared in business news, and 3 others she didn't know but who carried themselves with the same air of entitlement. "Good evening," Arya said with her practiced smile. "Welcome to Bellamy's. May I start you with some drinks this evening?" "Scotch for me. The Macallan 25, Maxwell said without looking at her. "And we'll need 2 bottles of the Chateau Margaux 2010 for the table." He turned to his guests. "Unless anyone objects to my choice?" No one did. No one ever did. As Arya turned to retrieve the drinks, Maxwell added, "And don't water down my scotch this time. I could taste the difference last visit." She paused, knowing full well that no one at Bellamy's would ever water down a $200 glass of scotch. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." While waiting for the bartender to locate the specific bottles, Arya watched through the doorway as the regular pianist settled in for his evening performance. Tonight he wore a slightly different tuxedo, but had the same detached expression as his fingers moved mechanically across the keys. Bellamy's paid well for the ambient music, but passion wasn't included in the price. When she returned with the drinks, Maxwell's party was deep in conversation about their latest acquisition, a historic apartment building on the east side that they planned to convert into luxury condominiums. "The current tenants are raising a fuss, of course," one of the women was saying, going on about community and history, as if a building falling apart has more value than what we're going to create. "People fear change," Maxwell replied, accepting his scotch from Arya without acknowledgement. "They'll thank us when their neighborhood property values double. If they can still afford to live there," the city council member said with a chuckle that wasn't quite humorous. Arya moved quietly around the table, placing wine glasses and pouring from the expensive bottles. She kept her expression neutral despite the conversation that hit close to home. Her own grandmother had lost her apartment of 30 years to a similar revitalization project, forcing her to move to a smaller place in a less convenient neighborhood during her final years. As she reached to pour wine for the attorney, Maxwell suddenly pushed his chair back, bumping Arya's arm. Wine splashed onto the white tablecloth, a few drops landing on the attorney's sleeve. "Careful," Maxwell snapped, as if he hadn't been the one to cause the spill. "This isn't some diner, girl." "I'm so sorry," Arya said immediately, setting down the bottle and reaching for her serving cloth. "Let me take care of that right away." "It's fine, really," the attorney said, dabbing at his sleeve. No harm done, but Maxwell wasn't satisfied. "This is exactly what I mean about service standards slipping everywhere. No attention to detail anymore." Arya felt her cheeks burn as she quickly cleaned the spill. The rest of the table had gone quiet, creating an uncomfortable silence that only emphasized her embarrassment. "Perhaps you should focus more on your job and less on eavesdropping on private conversations," Maxwell added, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear he had noticed her reaction to their earlier discussion. "Yes, sir. I apologize," Arya said quietly, wishing the floor would open up beneath her. Now, Max," the council member interjected. "No need to be harsh. Accidents happen." Maxwell's expression softened into something resembling a smile, though his eyes remained cold. "You're right, of course. I'm just passionate about excellence." He looked up at Arya as if seeing her for the first time. "Tell me, what's your name?" "Arya Johnson, sir." "Arya," he repeated, drawing out the syllables. "Like the musical term. How fitting for our setting tonight." He gestured toward the main dining room where the pianist could be heard playing a soft rendition of a popular classical piece. "Are you musical, Arya Johnson?" The question felt like a trap. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't making friendly conversation. "I enjoy music, sir," she answered carefully. "That wasn't my question," Maxwell pressed, his eyes fixed on her face. "I asked if you were musical." The others at the table were watching now, some with discomfort, others with the slightly entertained expression of people witnessing drama that didn't directly involve them. "I study piano at the School of Music," Arya admitted. Seeing no way to avoid answering, Maxwell's eyebrows rose. "A waitress with artistic aspirations? How original." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. "And what exactly does one do with a piano degree these days? Besides serving drinks to people who can actually afford concert tickets?" A few uncomfortable chuckles circled the table. The woman closest to Maxwell touched his arm lightly, as if suggesting he'd gone far enough. "I should check on your appetizers," Arya said, maintaining her professional tone despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I'll be right back." In the kitchen, she took a moment to collect herself, breathing deeply as she leaned against the wall. "Richardson giving you trouble?" asked Dion, glancing up from the plate he was garnishing. "Nothing I can't handle," Arya replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "That man is poison," Dion said, shaking his head. "He made Lisa cry last month. Just straight up made her cry, telling her she was too slow and probably didn't understand English well enough to be a server. Lisa, who's been here 10 years and speaks 3 languages. "I just need to get through tonight," Arya said, straightening up as the chef called that the appetizers for the private room were ready. The rest of the meal continued in a similar pattern. Maxwell found small ways to assert his dominance, criticizing the temperature of the food, questioning the wine pairing, making comments about Arya's appearance that danced on the line between observations and inappropriate remarks. Each time his companions would show momentary discomfort before laughing along, or simply pretending not to notice. By the time dessert was served, Arya felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the particular fatigue that came from maintaining composure in the face of persistent belittlement. But she was used to it. This wasn't her first difficult customer, and it wouldn't be her last. What she wasn't prepared for was what happened as the evening wound down and Maxwell's group lingered over coffee and cognac. The regular pianist had taken his break, leaving the grand piano temporarily unattended. Through the open door of the private dining room, the instrument was clearly visible, gleaming under the soft lighting of the main restaurant. Our entertainment has abandoned us, Maxwell remarked, gesturing toward the empty piano bench. He turned to Arya with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But we have our own pianist right here, don't we? How fortunate. Arya felt a chill run down her spine as every head at the table turned toward her. Arya stood frozen, the coffee pot still in her hand. She'd been caught in difficult situations with customers before. But something about Maxwell's expression made this feel different, more dangerous, more deliberate. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm working right now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, and quite poorly. "I might add," Maxwell replied with a smirk. "Perhaps you'd do better at the piano. After all, that's your true calling, isn't it?" He turned to his companions. "Wouldn't it be interesting to see if our server's musical education is worth the tuition?" The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The attorney checked his watch. The city council member suddenly became very interested in stirring his coffee. "I really couldn't," Arya said, feeling trapped. "The restaurant has professional musicians for entertainment." "But the professional is on break," Maxwell insisted, his voice hardening. "And I'm curious. After all, my foundation donates substantial amounts to arts education every year." He leaned back in his chair. "Consider it an audition." Arya glanced toward the main dining room, hoping to catch Mr. Reynolds' attention, but the manager was engaged with other customers. Dion appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, sensing something was wrong, but he had no authority to intervene. "It would only take a minute," the woman beside Maxwell added, perhaps trying to sound encouraging but coming across as complicit. "Just a short piece." "I don't think," Arya began. "I don't pay you to think," Maxwell interrupted. "I pay this establishment considerable sums for good service and a pleasant experience. Right now, I'd find it pleasant to hear what kind of talent the local music school is producing." His smile remained, but his eyes were cold. "Unless, of course, you've been lying about your abilities." The accusation hung in the air. Arya felt her cheeks burning. "Max, maybe we should just let the girl do her job," the council member finally said, though his tone was more placating than genuinely concerned. Maxwell waved him off. "This is her job, to ensure our satisfaction with the evening." He fixed his gaze on Arya again. "Well, surely a simple request from a valued customer isn't too much to ask. Or should I speak to your manager about your reluctance?" The threat was clear. Mr. Reynolds had made it abundantly clear that Maxwell Richardson's business was to be preserved at all costs. Complaints from him had resulted in servers being fired before. I'll play one piece," Arya conceded, setting down the coffee pot with a slightly trembling hand. "Excellent," Maxwell clapped his hands together. "Let's all move to the main dining room for a proper view, shall we?" He stood and the others followed suit, some exchanging glances that betrayed their discomfort with the situation. Maxwell led the way, making a show of it as they all filed out to the main restaurant floor. Several diners looked up, curious about the procession emerging from the private room. Maxwell stopped a passing waiter. "Where is the manager?" "Ah, there he is, Mr. Reynolds." Mr. Reynolds approached quickly, a practiced smile on his face. "Mr. Richardson, is everything to your satisfaction this evening?" "Almost everything," Maxwell replied. "Your waitress here has been keeping a secret from us. Did you know she studies piano at the School of Music? I've convinced her to play something for us while your regular musician is on break." Mr. Reynolds blinked, his smile faltering slightly as he glanced at Arya. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate during service." "Nonsense," Maxwell interrupted. "The piano is sitting there unused." The customers will enjoy a bit of variety. He lowered his voice, though not enough that Arya couldn't hear. Unless you'd prefer I take my business elsewhere in the future. I've heard the new place on 5th has an excellent chef. The threat hung in the air for just a moment before Mr. Reynolds' business sense overcame his better judgment. Of course, Mr. Richardson. If Arya is willing, we'd be delighted to hear her play. He turned to Arya with an apologetic look that also conveyed a clear message. Please just do this. The restaurant had grown quieter as people at nearby tables noticed the exchange. Arya felt dozens of eyes on her as Maxwell gestured grandly toward the piano. Your audience awaits, he said, the mockery barely concealed in his tone. Arya walked to the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. This wasn't how she had imagined her first time at this instrument, forced to perform for the amusement of a man who saw her as nothing more than a source of entertainment, a curiosity to be tested and likely ridiculed. As she sat on the bench, adjusting it slightly to reach the pedals properly, she heard Maxwell speaking loudly to his companions. This should be enlightening. Let's see what kind of music comes from someone like her. The words stung, their implication clear. But as Arya placed her fingers on the keys, something unexpected happened. The familiar feeling of ivory beneath her fingertips brought a wave of calm. This at least was something she knew, something no one could take from her. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes briefly and began to play. For a moment, she considered playing something simple, a basic piece that would fulfill Maxwell's demand without revealing too much of herself. But some small spark of defiance flickered within her. If she was going to be put on display, she would not diminish herself in the process. The first notes of Chopin's revolutionary etude filled the room, powerful, demanding, technically challenging. It was a piece she had perfected over hundreds of hours of practice, her fingers flying across the keys with a precision born of dedication and raw talent. The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff paused to listen, with Dion and 2 other cooks peering through the door to watch. Arya lost herself in the music. The humiliation of moments before faded away as her fingers danced across the keyboard, bringing forth cascades of notes that spoke of struggle, determination, and triumph. This piece, written by Chopin in response to the fall of Warsaw, filled with the composer's anger and hope, seemed to perfectly capture her own conflicted emotions. She was dimly aware of Maxwell's face, his smug expression giving way to surprise, then something like annoyance. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to be genuinely talented. He had wanted to embarrass her, to put her in her place. Instead, she was transforming his cruel joke into something beautiful. As the piece reached its climax, Arya felt tears threatening behind her eyes, not from sadness or humiliation, but from the pure release of playing with everything she had. She had nothing to prove to Maxwell Richardson or his friends, but in this moment, she was proving something to herself, that her worth wasn't determined by how others treated her. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a single person began to applaud. Others joined in, the applause building until it filled the space, genuine, appreciative, even awed. Arya opened her eyes to see several diners standing, their faces showing nothing but admiration. An elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes. A young couple exchanged glances of surprise and delight. She turned to look at Maxwell and his group. Most of them were applauding too, some with genuine appreciation, others with a slightly stunned expression. Only Maxwell himself stood stone-faced, his plan having backfired completely. Mr. Reynolds approached the piano, clapping along with the rest of the restaurant. That was extraordinary, Arya, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I had no idea we had such talent on our staff. Before Arya could respond, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached from a corner table. He wore a well-tailored suit and carried himself with quiet authority. Young lady, he said, extending his hand to Arya. That was remarkable. I'm Thomas Wilson, director of the Philharmonic's Young Artists program. Arya's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the name. Thomas Wilson was legendary in the music world, a champion of new talent and a gateway to professional opportunities that most students could only dream of. It's an honor to meet you, sir, she said, shaking his hand. The honor is mine, he replied. I'd very much like to speak with you about your musical future if you have a moment after your shift. He handed her a business card. Talent like yours deserves to be heard on a proper stage. Arya stared at the card in her hand, hardly believing what was happening. Thank you, sir. I'd like that very much. As Wilson returned to his table, Arya became aware that Maxwell was watching the exchange, his face flushed with what might have been anger or embarrassment or both. His attempt to humiliate her had instead opened a door she had been knocking on for years. Mr. Reynolds, reading the room perfectly, stepped in. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your meals. Our regular pianist will return shortly, but I think we can all agree that was a special treat. He turned to Arya. Thank you. Arya, you can return to your duties now. As Arya stood from the piano bench, she caught Maxwell's eye. For just a moment, they looked at each other directly. The powerful man who had tried to use her as entertainment, and the waitress whose talent had turned the tables on him. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Instead, she gave him a small, dignified nod before walking past him with her head held high. Behind her, she heard one of Maxwell's companions say, "Well, that was unexpected." Indeed it was, Arya thought as she returned to the kitchen. Indeed it was. The kitchen was unusually quiet when Arya pushed through the swinging doors. The normal clatter of pots and pans had paused, and the entire staff stood looking at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. "What?" she asked, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Dion was the first to speak. "What do you mean, what? You just played like you were at Carnegie Hall, that's what." He slow-clapped, and others joined in until the entire kitchen staff was applauding. "Stop it. You guys," Arya said, though she couldn't help smiling. "I still have tables to serve." "Your tables can wait 30 seconds, said Vivian, who had slipped into the kitchen to witness the aftermath. "That was incredible, Arya. I had no idea you could play like that." "I've been practicing since I was 5, Arya shrugged, trying to downplay the moment despite the warmth spreading through her chest. Recognition from her co-workers felt genuine in a way that the polite applause from diners hadn't. "Well, you just shut down the richest jerk in the city," Dion said with evident satisfaction. "Did you see his face? Man looked like he'd swallowed a lemon." The head chef, who rarely engaged in kitchen gossip, looked up from the dish he was plating. "That Richardson fellow deserved every note of it," he said simply before returning to his work. Coming from him, it felt like the highest praise. Mr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "Arya, a word, please?" The kitchen fell silent again. Despite the positive reception from the diners, Arya knew she had technically broken protocol. Servers weren't supposed to engage with the piano, which was reserved for hired performers. She followed Mr. Reynolds to his small office near the coat check, preparing herself for a reprimand. To her surprise, he closed the door and then broke into a broad smile. "That was quite something," he said, shaking his head in wonderment. "I've been managing restaurants for 23 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it." "I'm sorry if I caused any problems," Arya said cautiously. "I know it's not part of my job description." "Problems?" Mr. Reynolds laughed. "You've given this place more positive buzz in 5 minutes than our PR firm has managed in a year. My phone is already blowing up with texts from regular customers who were here tonight." He pulled out his phone to show her. "Look at this. 3 different people saying they'll be bringing friends next week specifically because of the amazing piano server." Arya blinked, unsure how to respond. "Now," Mr. Reynolds continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, "Thomas Wilson asked to speak with you after your shift. He's a very important figure in the music world." "I know who he is," Arya said softly. "Of course you do. He's requested that you be allowed to finish your shift an hour early to meet with him. I've already arranged for Zoe to cover your tables." He paused, studying her face. "This could be a significant opportunity for you, Arya." "Thank you," she managed, still processing everything that was happening. "No need to thank me. Just keep playing like that and make sure everyone knows where you work," he said with a wink. "Now you should check on your tables. Mr. Richardson's party is preparing to leave." Arya's stomach tightened at the mention of Maxwell. After the triumph at the piano, facing him again felt like a step backward. But she nodded and headed back to the main dining room. Maxwell and his companions had returned to the private room to gather their belongings. As Arya approached with their check, the conversation died down. Several of the guests looked at her with new interest, while others seemed embarrassed about their earlier complicity in Maxwell's behavior. "Your check, sir?" she said professionally. placing the leather folder on the table. Maxwell didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between annoyance and curiosity. "That was quite a performance," he said finally. "Where did you study before the School of Music?" The question caught her off guard. It was the first time he had asked anything about her with seemingly genuine interest. "I learned from my grandmother initially," Arya answered truthfully. "She played for her church for 40 years. Then I had a scholarship for youth lessons at the Community Arts Center through high school." Maxwell nodded slowly, as if filing away the information. "Interesting. And what piece was that?" "Chopin, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir." "The Revolutionary Etude." "Appropriate choice," he said, and Arya couldn't tell if he meant it as a compliment or a criticism. After a moment, he reached for the check, glanced at it, and pulled out a sleek wallet from his inner jacket pocket. He placed several bills inside the folder and handed it back without another word. "Thank you for dining with us tonight," Arya said, the standard closing line feeling strangely inadequate after everything that had transpired. "Have a good evening." As the party filed out, one of the women paused beside Arya. "That was truly beautiful playing," she said quietly. "You have a rare gift." Before Arya could thank her, the woman hurried to catch up with the others. When they had gone, Arya opened the check folder, curious despite herself about whether Maxwell had tipped. Inside, she found the payment for the bill, exact to the penny without a single dollar in gratuity. Beneath it was a business card. Maxwell Richardson, CEO, Richardson Development Group. On the back, written in precise handwriting, were the words, "Talent is meaningless without the right connections." Arya stared at the card, torn between anger and disbelief. Even after her performance, he couldn't acknowledge her skill without reminding her of her place in his world. Beneath him, dependent on people like him for any chance at success. She slipped the card into her pocket, not sure why she was keeping it. Perhaps as a reminder of what she was fighting against. The remainder of her shift passed in a blur. Regular customers who had witnessed her playing stopped her to offer compliments. A few asked if she would be performing again. One elderly couple pressed a $20 bill into her hand, insisting it was for music school, not for the service. As her early release time approached, Arya grew increasingly nervous about meeting Thomas Wilson. She checked her appearance in the staff bathroom mirror, wished she had something nicer than her server's uniform to wear, and took several deep breaths to calm her racing heart. Mr. Reynolds found her as she was clocking out. "Wilson is waiting in the small private dining room," he said. "Take as much time as you need." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever happens, Arya, you still have a job here, but I hope you won't need it much longer." The sentiment, so different from his usual business-focused mentality, touched her. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Thomas Wilson stood as Arya entered the room. Up close, he looked older than he had from a distance, his face lined with the wisdom of decades in the music world. But his eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing. "Arya Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "Please sit down. Would you like something to drink? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be nice, thank you," she said, her mouth suddenly dry. He poured her a glass from a carafe on the table and sat across from her. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "Your playing tonight was exceptional. Raw in places, perhaps, but with an emotional depth that can't be taught." He studied her face. "How long have you been at the School of Music?" 2 years, sir." "And working here the whole time?" Arya nodded. "Full-time work, part-time study. It's all I can afford." Wilson frowned slightly. "Talent like yours should be nurtured properly, not squeezed between serving shifts." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "The Young Artist Program offers full scholarships to exceptional musicians. We provide mentorship, performance opportunities, and a stipend for living expenses." Arya stared at the folder, afraid to open it. Dreams this big didn't happen to people like her. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "There are many talented students." Wilson smiled, the expression warming his serious face. "Because when you played, everyone in this restaurant stopped breathing for a moment. That's rare, Ms. Johnson, very rare." He gestured to the folder. "The program starts in 3 weeks. It would mean leaving your job here and focusing entirely on your music." With trembling fingers, Arya opened the folder. Inside were details of the program, which was even more prestigious than she had realized. Only 5 musicians were accepted each year. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Say you'll consider it, Wilson replied. We have an audition process, of course, but after what I heard tonight, that's merely a formality. He pulled out another business card, the second one she'd received that night, but so different from the first. Call my office tomorrow to schedule. I will, Arya promised, clutching the folder like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. As Wilson stood to leave, he paused, his expression turning thoughtful. May I ask what made you choose that particular piece tonight? The revolutionary etude is challenging, to say the least. Arya considered her answer carefully. It was the first piece that came to mind, she said finally. It felt right for the moment. Wilson nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. Indeed. Chopin wrote it after Warsaw fell to the Russians. He poured all his anger and hope into those notes. He smiled again. Sometimes the right piece finds us when we need it most. After he left, Arya remained seated, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. The folder in front of her represented everything she had worked for since she was a child, sitting at her grandmother's piano. Everything she had sacrificed for, struggled for, and it had come because Maxwell Richardson had tried to humiliate her. Life was strange that way, she thought. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best opportunities. That didn't excuse his behavior, but it gave it a purpose she hadn't seen before. She gathered her things, said goodnight to the staff, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights sparkled around her, and for the first time in years, they seemed to be shining just for her. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Arya stood in the wings of the Wilson Concert Hall, her heart pounding against her ribs. She smoothed down the front of her new black dress, the first, truly formal performance attire she'd ever owned, and tried to control her breathing, the way her new instructor had taught her. 5 minutes. Ms. Johnson, the stagehand whispered. Clipboard in hand, Arya nodded, unable to form words. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind that still felt dreamlike. Her formal audition for the Young Artists program had gone even better than her impromptu performance at Bellamy's. Thomas Wilson had personally congratulated her afterward, introducing her to the other 4 musicians selected for this year's cohort: a violinist from Korea, a cellist from Peru, a clarinetist from Detroit, and a composer from Ukraine. Leaving Bellamy's had been bittersweet. Her co-workers had thrown her a small party in the kitchen after her final shift, with Dion presenting her with a card signed by everyone. Mr. Reynolds had shaken her hand firmly and told her she'd always have a table reserved whenever she wanted to return, as a guest, not a server. You're going to make us all proud, Vivian had said, hugging her tightly. Don't forget us when you're famous. Now, just 21 days later, she was about to perform in her first recital as part of the Young Artists program. The concert hall wasn't large. It seated only about 300 people, but it was prestigious, known for launching significant careers. Every seat was filled tonight. 2 minutes, the stagehand returned to say. Arya peeked through the curtain. In the front row, she could see Thomas Wilson sitting beside the dean of the School of Music. Several of her professors were scattered throughout the audience. Along with a few familiar faces from Bellamy's, Dion and Vivian had claimed seats in the 3rd row, both looking slightly out of place but beaming with pride. What none of them knew was how quickly news of her confrontation with Maxwell Richardson had spread. Someone at Bellamy's that night had recorded her playing on their phone. The video, along with the story of how she came to be at the piano, had gone viral. Waitress forced to perform by wealthy customer stuns audience with hidden talent was the headline that had caught fire online, leading to hundreds of thousands of views and shares. The publicity had been both uncomfortable and helpful. Arya had declined interviews, preferring to focus on her music rather than becoming a momentary internet sensation. But the video had brought attention to the Young Artist program and led to several anonymous donations earmarked specifically for musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. The largest of these donations had arrived just yesterday, $50,000, with a cryptic note that read only, "Talent deserves nurturing, regardless of circumstance." Arya had her suspicions about who might have sent it, but she kept them to herself. "It's time, Ms. Johnson," the stagehand said, interrupting her thoughts. Arya took one final deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she'd expected, making it difficult to see individual faces beyond the first few rows. She approached the gleaming, Grand piano, a Steinway that was worlds away from the upright she had practiced on in her grandmother's living room, and bowed to the applause. As she took her seat and adjusted the bench, her mind flashed back to that night at Bellamy's, to the fear and humiliation she had felt when Maxwell had demanded she play. How different this moment was, surrounded by people who wanted to hear her, who believed in her talent, who had come specifically to witness her art. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. She had chosen to open with Chopin's revolutionary Etude, the same piece she had played that night. It felt right to begin with it, to acknowledge the journey that had brought her here. As her fingers flew over the keys, she poured every emotion of the past few weeks into the music, the fear, the triumph, the disbelief, the joy. But it was her second piece that truly showcased her growth. In the 3 weeks since joining the program, she had finished the composition she'd been working on for months, the one she used to tinker with on her keyboard with the missing D-sharp key in her tiny apartment after late-night shifts. Her instructor had helped her refine it, but the heart of the piece remained purely hers. She had titled it Service, and as she began to play, she could feel the audience leaning forward in their seats. The piece began softly, almost hesitantly, with a repeating pattern in the left hand that suggested routine, repetition, the daily grind. But the right hand soon introduced a soaring melody that rose above the pattern, reaching for something more. As the composition progressed, the two elements, routine and aspiration, engaged in a kind of conversation, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. The middle section grew turbulent, with dissonant chords and rapid runs that resolved into moments of surprising beauty before building to a powerful climax. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted in applause, people rising to their feet row by row. Aria stood, overwhelmed by the response, and bowed deeply. As she straightened, she caught sight of a figure standing at the back of the hall, a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair in an expensive suit. Maxwell Richardson hadn't taken a seat but stood against the wall, his expression unreadable from this distance. As their eyes met across the concert hall, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to leave. Aria wasn't sure how to feel about his presence. Part of her wanted to reject any acknowledgement from him after how he had treated her. Another part understood that in some strange way, she owed her current opportunity to his cruelty. Not because he had been right to demean her, but because his attempt to humiliate her had instead revealed her true worth to those who could help her achieve her dreams. Later, at the reception following the recital, Thomas Wilson introduced her to several important figures in the music world. Conductors, composers, directors of arts organizations. She shook hands and accepted compliments, still feeling slightly out of place in these circles but growing more confident with each conversation. "You are magnificent," said an older woman with elegant white hair, who Wilson had introduced as the chair of the Philharmonic's board. "That original composition especially, so much emotional depth." "Thank you," Aria replied sincerely. "It's been a journey getting here." "The best musicians always have a story behind their music," the woman said. "Yours comes through in every note." As the evening wound down, Aria found herself standing near the large windows overlooking the city lights. Dion and Vivian had just left after enthusiastic hugs and promises to attend her next performance. Her professors had offered heartfelt congratulations. Even her elderly neighbor, who had patiently endured years of her practicing through thin apartment walls, had come with flowers. Thomas Wilson joined her by the window, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "Quite a night, Miss Johnson." "Yes, sir. Thank you again for this opportunity." Wilson smiled. "Talent like yours creates its own opportunities. I merely opened a door you were already well on your way to finding." He glanced around the emptying ER.